Thank you so much for joining us this evening. You will be able to find the recording and the presentations of this evening's presentation on the BASAMP website, and we will share with you that website as well. You'll also find, again, recordings from all the past website presentations and webinars we've hosted. So the BASAMP is a process that has been underway by the state to sort of look at future growth of aquaculture in Narragansett Bay, Rhode Island, and these educational series have been a complement to a public process that many of you have been involved in since last year. So again, thank you so much for joining us. And we're very happy to have two esteemed guests, Chris Schillaci, or the NOAA Aquaculture Coordinator for the Greater Atlantic region. He's based in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and also represents Narragansett, Rhode Island in his work. And he will present on NOAA, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's joint federal efforts to support development of best management practices, standards, and conservation recommendations for shellfish aquaculture in our region. So he'll present a broader perspective on floating aquaculture gear, which can be controversial, and on what that looks like from a national perspective. Then we will hear from Dr. Bob Rheault. He's the Executive Director of the East Coast Shellfish Growers Association. He has served on NOAA's Marine Fisheries Advisory Council and many other organizations. He was one of the first sort of modern day farmer for shellfish in Rhode Island, but he also serves on all sorts of important boards and has that real perspective and advocates for regional aquaculture issues for the industry. And he will talk a little bit more about some of the work happening to develop these best management practices for aquaculture floating gear in Rhode Island and our near states. And please just look for the recording and pass that along to those colleagues you might have who couldn't attend. I would ask that you reserve your questions for the end. Dr. Schillaci and then Dr. Rheault will present in that order, and then we'll read from the chat. If it's looking like we have room, you can sort of state your question too, but just to make sure everybody's questions are answered, please put those in the chat. You can do that as you have them, and then we'll read from them in order. All right. With that, Chris, thank you so much for attending. You can kick off and share your screen, and we very much look forward to hearing your perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Azure, and thanks everyone for joining. Let me, are you able to see the full screen?
We can see that, yep, just if you could switch it to presentation mode, be ideal.
How's this? Sorry, let me get that.
That's okay. No problem. Even in this day and age, there's always a something in the Zoom world.
How are we doing now?
That is perfect. Thank you, Chris. Go for it.
Right. Well, thanks everybody for having me. I should say I am not a doctor, just a master's, but I appreciate the thought, Azure. So my name is Chris Schillaci. I'm one of two regional aquaculture coordinators for the National Marine Fisheries Service, otherwise known as NOAA Fisheries, out of our Greater Atlantic Regional Fisheries Office. So as Azure said, I'm going to touch a bit on federal agency efforts related to the development of BMP's guidance and conservation recommendations for floating aquaculture gear. So just a quick, brief NOAA, or NOAA generally, our mission is science, stewardship, and service. And our main focus is to conserve and manage coastal marine ecosystems and resources. Specifically, NOAA Fisheries is responsible for ensuring productive and sustainable fisheries, safe sources of seafood, recovery and conservation of protected resources, and healthy ecosystems. And we view aquaculture as playing a critical role in achieving all four of those aspects of our mission. So I know there's a lot of text here, but I think this is an important way to couch NOAA's role with aquaculture, NOAA Fisheries' role with aquaculture. So we see an increase in sustainable marine aquaculture production is as a significant part of our strategy, both nationally and regionally, for economic and environmental resiliency. We believe well-sited and well-managed marine aquaculture can enhance coastal resiliency, create jobs, improve food security, and it's a valuable tool to help rebuild some protected species and habitats. But we know the coastal and offshore waters where aquaculture occurs are some of the most ecologically, culturally, and economically important shared spaces. They're also some of the busiest, and we have a responsibility to consider all of our agency conservation objectives and various stakeholder viewpoints as we pursue kind of strategies to foster a growth in aquaculture. So how do we achieve that balance? NOAA has stood up a very robust aquaculture program that cuts across 3 of our line items: NOAA Fisheries, Sea Grant, and the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science. At NOAA Fisheries, where I'm based, we have a focus on policy and research. Policy and regulatory aspects of aquaculture. And I'll touch a bit more on how NOAA works in the regulatory side of aquaculture. We also do a significant amount of aquaculture outreach, both to help engage and inform managers responsible for aquaculture review, as well as the general public and aquaculture growers. And a big part of our portfolio is science for sound aquaculture development through external grants and with our fishery science centers. NOAA conducts a significant amount of science, both focused on increasing sustainable production, but really focused on tools for managers. How can we pursue sustainable aquaculture while keeping our conservation objectives in mind? Sea Grant hosts wonderful events like this, as well as a significant amount of external funding and grants to pursue aquaculture science and sustainability. They also have a significant portfolio with aquaculture education and extension. And NCOS provides substantial tools and services that help with spatial planning and siting for aquaculture. They support an evaluation and implementation of aquaculture that promotes ecosystem services, as well as environmental monitoring and modeling. You know, as we know, marine aquaculture operates in under a pretty comprehensive regulatory framework. There's a number of statutes that apply to floating aquaculture gear in particular. The Rivers and Harbors Act, administered by the Army Corps of Engineers, deals with the placement of structures in navigable waters. The Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act requires consultation with NOAA Fisheries and the Army Corps of Engineers and a consideration of impacts on essential fish habitat. Likewise, the Endangered Species Act requires consultation to look at how proposed aquaculture projects and floating gear might impact protected and threatened species. Again, NOAA Fisheries also works with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Act and consults with federal agencies and the Army Corps on proposed aquaculture actions. We all work under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and floating gear also intersects with the National Shellfish Sanitation Program and the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. And key here, because some of these particular legislations or statutes and the regulations at times might push aquaculture to floating gear to avoid impacts on the bottom, might push aquaculture back to the bottom to avoid impacts on protected species, and concerns around bird and mammal waste. So there's often a kind of a competing view and a competing push for how these statutes are applied, that often the grower is kind of stuck in the middle. So with all these laws, why do we need best practices? B&Ps can improve predictability, increase consistency of project design and review, reduce permitting timeframes and delays, and contribute to conservation of natural resources. And for us, this all can lead to improved environmental outcomes. When growers anticipate potential impacts, they can incorporate B&Ps into project design, avoid, minimize, and mitigate the types of impacts of concern to permit reviewers, and help speed the process for obtaining approvals for projects. And this is a key part. We work really hard with pre-application coordination so that we can get this information in front of proponents and they can incorporate it into design scenarios and alternatives when they consider their project. It's important to note, not all B&Ps may apply for all projects. And adoption of B&Ps in a project design does not guarantee the outcome of permitting decisions. So I just want to touch on some of the regulatory side of aquaculture permitting, and in particular floating gear permitting. So shellfish aquaculture projects will generally require a Section 10 permit from under the Rivers and Harbors Act from the Army Corps of Engineers. And in New England, the Army Corps of Engineers New England District has established general permits for each New England state. And these allow for certain activities determined to have a minimal impact to have a more efficient permitting process. More complex, larger projects not eligible under the general permits require an individual permit. If you can see, generally speaking, projects are limited either based on size or their potential for impacts to things like special aquatic sites, including submerged aquatic vegetation or other sensitive resources. So while the general permits aren't necessarily best management practices, they encourage adoption of siting practices and gear, the use of gear that limits impacts to sensitive resources with the incentive of more efficient permitting timelines. The Army Corps of Engineers has developed a couple best practices or recommendations around engagement from aquaculture. And these generally apply to many permitting processes. Engage early and often to ensure all required information is submitted. Pre-application meetings are highly encouraged. Be prepared for additional information requests, and in particular to support the consultations I'll speak on next. While any permitting agency strives for specific permit application review timelines, they may take longer. The more complicated the project and the less information, the less likely it is to meet those established timelines. So now I'm going to touch on consultations conducted by NOAA Fisheries. So federal permitting agencies must consult with NOAA Fisheries, and in some cases, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, on proposed actions that may adversely affect threatened and endangered species, fisheries habitat, and fish and wildlife resources and habitat. And below are the three main statutes that require these consultations. So essential fish habitat conservation or consultations require federal agencies to consult when activities they authorize may adversely affect essential fish habitat. The consultation is between NOAA Fisheries and the Federal Action Agency. The Federal Action Agency works with the proponent to gather the information necessary to be able to engage NOAA Fisheries. Once NOAA Fisheries receives the information, they review it and provide conservation recommendations. In this case, they may be adopted by the permitting agency, they may not. But the permitting agency is required to provide a written response that describes those measures that have been taken to avoid, mitigate, and offset impacts of activities on EFH. And if they don't, they have to explain why. What's key here is because not all federal permitting agencies understand what options are available to growers. And so having that information within your application, explain how you've avoided or cited your project, designed your project to avoid those impacts, can reduce those permitting timelines. So just for some background, EFH is designated between NOAA and our fisheries management councils, and it includes water substrate necessary for fish spawning, breeding, feeding, and growth to maturity. Many of those that are present in Rhode Island include, hard bottom, submerged aquatic vegetation, and this doesn't include just eelgrass. It also includes any macroalgae and associated biological communities. We also consult with the Army Corps of Engineers and other permitting agencies under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. Certain species such as shellfish, crustaceans, forest species, all of these both are part of EFH or covered under the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act. Something that's particularly important within Rhode Island is habitat areas of particular concern, which are a subset of EFH. And these are areas that provide important ecological functions, sensitive to human-induced environmental degradation, are rare, and are stressed by development activities. In Rhode Island, summer flounder, HAPC, which includes submerged aquatic vegetation, is of particular importance. It's important to note that this isn't just eelgrass. This also could be other macroalgae, including non-native species of macroalgae, which, as I mentioned before, can kind of create some competing conservation objectives as we seek to remove or manage invasive species. But at the same time, some of these invasive species are providing habitat for important recreational and commercial species. The other is juvenile cod HAPC, and include rock reef and cobble, pebble, or gravel habitats with or without SAB. Some important considerations for floating gear in Rhode Island. The major habitat considerations for floating gear is shading over SAB, and the moorings and anchors, and the potential for chain sweep within these EFH and HAPC areas. So some general aquaculture BMPs here: avoid and minimize adverse effects to tidal SAS, intertidal mudflats, and natural rocky habitats. Avoid siting within rocky cobble habitat when possible. If you're siting within rocky cobble habitat, avoid seasonal sinking of gear on bottom. Identify alternative sites if you're using those sites for floating gear in the summertime, where you can sink without the potential to scour epifauna and roll over cobbles or other rocks that might remove that attached macroalgae. Elevate gear off bottom, as much as possible. This not only helps prevent scour and direct physical alteration, but it also limits hydrodynamic changes that could impact important benthic habitats. And minimize chain length for any on-bottom or floating structures, and consider a midline buoy that might hold chains off the seafloor. NOAA Fisheries has worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to establish a programmatic consultation for certain activities that have impacts below established thresholds and follows standard conservation recommendations. It's important to note that the thresholds that we establish, whether it be in the GP or in the programmatic consultations, are not necessarily levels of acceptable impacts. What they are opportunities to avoid impacts, to create permitting efficiencies by avoiding impacts and minimizing impacts to certain sensitive and protected resources and habitats. So NOAA is also responsible for Endangered Species Act Section 7 consultations. The federal action agencies must consult with NOAA Fisheries on activities that may affect ESA-listed species. These consultations, otherwise known as Section 7 consultations, are designed to assist NOAA Fisheries as we seek to protect and conserve, or to conserve and protected species. Through this Section 7 consultation process, we work with federal action agencies that permit aquaculture projects to provide information how to best avoid or minimize the project impact on ESA-listed species of whales, sea turtles, and fish in any designated critical habitat. I should also note that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the federal action agencies also consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, primarily on potential impacts to bird species and aquaculture interactions. So NOAA Fisheries does not have required management measures that apply to all aquaculture projects. Because each project is unique, we evaluate each project on a case-by-case basis, taking into account the area that the project will affect, the species that may be affected, what we know about the proposed gear types. So, some ways, general ways to mitigate risk of aquaculture is minimizing the number of vertical lines, maintaining tension on all lines under tidal conditions, and to the extent possible, avoid the loss, conservation, or conversion of seafloor foraging habitat. Same goes for whales, as we see for sea turtles and sturgeon, but in addition, consider installing weak links where they may be appropriate. But again, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and the adoption of risk reduction techniques depends on the type of gear, the likelihood of the species or critical habitat present, and what is known about the feasibility of potential gear modifications and technical constraints on the project itself. And work with your Corps managers, make sure that they have enough information to know what is feasible, as well as consider the project area and what species are there. They'll work with the GARFO protected species folks to identify which and what measures may be appropriate. So I'll just point you that there's a number of additional links on our website that talk about our consultations, link to best management practices on the state, local, and geographic and regional level, as well as a number of other resources that might help with project permitting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was great. Dr. Rheault, would you like to share your screen and kick off. Again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat now to keep track of them, and certainly we'll address them when Bob has finished his presentation.
So Azure, are you seeing
Yeah.
my notes on the side? Or are you
I
seeing...
am.
Okay, then I'm going to go back.
You can flip screens to, you can switch which screen you're sharing to.
Working on it. I was just trying to figure out how I could see my notes. Oh dear.
And Chris, I apologize for calling you a doctor. Maybe it's you know, an honorary Rhode Island Sea Grant degree for your service in NOAA. My apologies.
My diploma in the mail.
Yes, yes.
Well done, Dr. Schillaci.
That's right. And that looks great, Steve. You're good to go.
All right. So Chris and I are both a little under the weather, so we'll try and do this the best we can. Thanks for inviting me to present. And first of all, I'm just going to start right off with, you know, what are best practices? How do they differ from regulations? And why are they preferable to regulations in certain cases? And so, you know, first I have to start with my obligatory slide about shellfish farming being the most sustainable protein on the planet. It's the highest value product landed from Rhode Island state waters. It's nutritious and delicious. We also have the highest value per acre in many cases, up to $140,000 per acre with an average of $20,000 per acre yield in aquaculture. So we're right up there with marijuana production. Jobs and economic development, you know, it's an excellent tourism draw. In one state that I work in, I've got a member who's selling thousands of tickets for $100 a piece for people who want to come and see sustainable shellfish farming and how it's done. And of course, we are environmental watchdogs. We don't have a choice of moving our farm if the water quality changes. So we are some of the most staunch advocates of preserving water quality out there. So what is a best practice? Well, you know, in broad terms, if you Google it, it's a technique that leads to a desired result. It's a non-regulatory way, although sometimes, like Florida, has best management practices that are indeed regulations, but they are usually voluntary. And what sets them apart is they are able to be flexible and adaptable, which is really important. On the right, you can see some of the laws that Chris stated that we work under. We are very heavily regulated. I always joke that we are more heavily regulated than nuclear waste disposal. I don't know, it's probably close to true, but we do work under a number of hard and fast regulations. But what are some of the differences between laws and regulations versus best practices? Well, laws are enacted by legislation, which tends to be glacial. And then the regulations attempt to codify the intent of the laws, and they can be a little bit more flexible. You have a better chance of changing a regulation than a law. And then oftentimes regulatory agencies will develop guidance that interprets those regulations, and they are typically enforced by the government. And best practices, contrary, are developed by an industry consensus, typically with a bottom-up. They are often enforced by peer pressure, and occasionally through a third-party audit. So you can see they're quite different vehicles. So there's a number of different people have looked at how best to get compliance from the regulated community. Do laws work? You know, can CDM and CRMC do the job? But what we often see is that scofflaws are incredibly inventive. They spend an incredible amount of time. I don't know how many of you have a fuzzbuster in your car, or you know. But what I do see is that a number of people who don't agree with certain regulations spend an inordinate amount of time trying to get around regulations. And then again, some violators perceive the penalties as just a cost of doing business. So why are best practices occasionally better? Well, peer pressure can be actually more effective in certain cases. Since these practices are typically developed by consensus among industry members, we've got good buy-in. We recognize the benefits of being a good actor and having a good public image. And we also recognize the costs of bad actors to our industry. There's a joke for farmers that the greatest fear of an established farmer is the new farmer, because he's going to do something that gives our industry a bad image. And the other thing is that we're always out there on the water. We work hard. Many of us are out there, 5 days a week at least. Try and stay away from the weekends because it's too crazy out there. But we're out there most days, almost year round. And we know the rules, so we can spot the violators. And I always had DEM on my speed dial. If I saw somebody, digging in a polluted zone or wasn't doing the right thing, I never hesitated to drop a dime. I don't want a bad actor to get somebody sick or to give my industry a black eye. Oftentimes, best practices can be stricter than the laws or the regulations. For instance, the law, the Right to Farm Act, says I can go out at dawn and make as much noise as I like, as long as it's a normal farming practice. But that does not mean it's the right thing for us to do. So we have best practices established that are actually stricter than the laws. We operate in the commons. We know that bad actors will damage the social license to operate. And the states are, compelled, typically by their state constitution, to weigh the public interest and the cost benefit of all the various uses of their commons. We have to work on harmony and compatibility and balance, and the state certainly is tasked with balancing the multiple uses in an equitable fashion. Oftentimes, our state constitution says that the state is bound to manage the commons for the benefit of the sovereign, which means the benefit of all the people in the state. And so they look at the various costs and benefits of all the various users of the commons and try and balance those multiple users. The best part of best practices is that they can be nimble. And this industry is very young and it's evolving at a very rapid pace. So, many of the growing methods that are in use now would have been illegal if we didn't have the ability to innovate. When I started, I wanted to do bottom cages. That was not a thing that was being done then. We are seeing new developments right and left. Oyster grow cages have only been around for about 13 years. Now we've got flip farms on the horizon. I was just talking to an innovator who's developed another new gear type that's coming on the market next year that I think is going to solve a lot of management problems. But what we need to do is allow growers to innovate to achieve goals as opposed to simply writing rules that stifle innovation. An example of this was up in Maine, where instead of having regulations, they were trying to get the salmon farmers to figure out how to prevent escapes. And they allowed the industry to experiment with a number of different methods. And over time, they figured it out. They haven't had an escaped salmon in 25 years. They haven't had use of antibiotics in 25 years. I don't think that people really understand that. So it was the flexibility of best practices that allowed that innovation to occur and allow the growers to develop in what is really a very young and rapidly evolving industry. So, a mature industry, the professionals in this industry are definitely trying to protect ourselves from the bad actors so that we can avoid overregulation. Because if the bad actors screw it up, it's going to come back in the form of the heavy hammer of regulations. And so, we took an interesting step. The Ocean State Aquaculture Association met a couple weeks ago, and we decided that we're going to be reviewing future applications and deciding whether we think that they are in the best interests of the established growers, because we can't have people stepping in it and making it an unwelcome environment for professional operators. So, we have an OSAA code of practice, and this is a very, very brief overview of what we've had since 2005. We recognize that we need to update this, but it's motherhood and apple pie: ensure sustainability, protect the environment, retrieve lost gear, prevent disease introduction, maintain records, promote industry training and education, act in harmony, support scientific research. We need to update this. Many states have codes of practice and best practices, and these are all living documents, and we recognize that we haven't really looked at this for a number of years, and we need to do a better job. Also, my association got a grant from the Nature Conservancy, the SOAR project, to update our best management practices. The ECSGA has best practices on our website that anybody can take a look at. They're a little bit kludgy. Right now, they're run through a sort of a virus-prone Excel spreadsheet, but one thing that is glaringly absent is when we wrote them, we didn't have floating gear in mind. So the flip farm that you see in the top right, the oyster grow cage in the lower right, the SEPA baskets in the lower left that are quite popular in Australia and curiously down in the Gulf. None of those were invented when we wrote this. So we have to update our BMPs to address this need. And I've been holding workshops up and down the coast, and we are going to be rewriting those over the coming year. Admittedly, sometimes you absolutely do need regulation and enforcement. And, we believe that certainly in Rhode Island, the current enforcement capacity is probably inadequate. We should probably revisit the memorandum of understanding between DEM and CRMC, and because it's almost impossible for one man, Ben Getch, to do all the permitting and all the site inspections that are required, so that we can make sure that everybody's paying attention to the rules and doing that. We as an industry support rigid enforcement of existing regulations, and if there are bad actors, I would prefer to have them out of our industry. The other factor is that not every grower is going to choose to join the association, and not every grower is going to choose to buy into the code of practice. So there are times when you do need enforcement of regulations. But we still believe that best practices are superior most of the time, because we know that peer pressure works. In many cases, we know that there's just not enough enforcement officers to be out there all the time. DEM is stretched thin, and CRMC is stretched even thinner. So we know that we can be the eyes and ears on the water, and we can be oftentimes effective in maintaining the fact that keeping growers in line and following the norms. I personally cannot tolerate a messy farm, somebody getting people sick. These are just untenable. We cannot have that in our industry. I tend to be pretty rigid there. And so I know that there's this move out to reform the CRMC, and the Ocean State Aquaculture has written that we believe that we agree that the CRMC needs certain reforms, including better enforcement, improved appointment and training of council members, and an independent legal representation. In fact, most of the changes that have been proposed by Save the Bay, we are in full agreement. So we hope that process moves forward, but we also hope that the process doesn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, we believe that aquaculture is great for Rhode Island. We believe that I bet almost everybody on this call would probably agree that we should be devoting some portion of our commons to the sustainable production of seafood. The real question is where that's going to be and where it shouldn't be. And we're working through that. And I hope that we can get back to face-to-face meetings of the Aquaculture Working Group where we hash through these rather challenging process and get to a point where we can reach consensus about where those sites should be, because that's been a process that's worked well over the past couple of decades. So as I mentioned, we are revising our BMPs, and these are some of the ideas that have come up through our workshops. I've got a list of about 40. I'm only going to cover a few of them, but some of the most important ones are regular inspection for chafing, so your gear doesn't get away. regular flipping or drying for fouling so that your gear doesn't become a mop of algae that ends up attracting, well, it's unsightly, it's not great for the crop, and it will attract birds. Uniformity of buoys and nice straight lines. We don't want anybody's farm to look like a junkyard. Appropriate marking of the bounds, and by appropriate, I mean it needs to be flexible. If you're out there in the channel, you need to have a light on it probably because there's ships. But if you're, you know, tucked up against a rock or an island and you're in a coastal pond, the waterfront homeowners probably don't want to see lights blinking on the pond in front of their house. So appropriate, we need to try and balance the need to protect navigation while also understanding that the bounds themselves can be a visual impairment or unsightly to the waterfront homeowners. Gear marking, we are advocating for marking of gear so that when it gets loose, we can, first of all, retrieve it and return it, but also make sure that the person whose gear is getting away hopefully revises their policies and their anchoring and their attachment policies so that they aren't letting their gear get away in the future. We believe in having a good neighbor policy and where possible, accommodating multiple uses. So, you know, I've always welcomed kayakers and sailors and boaters and where possible, fishermen on my lease. I know that's not going to work in every lease, but I'm pretty sure that almost any shellfish farmer, you can kayak through their farm and nobody's going to say that's a problem. Obviously, there are going to be challenges with different types of gear and different types of multiple uses. So again, you know, some of the other revised BMPs, flexible and appropriate anchoring. One of the things that came up during these workshops was if you have an auger anchor and an ice flow comes along or an incredible storm comes along, you're likely to shear a line, in which case you lose the entire farm. Whereas if you've got blocks or mushrooms, the farm might drag for a quarter mile or so, but you can always drag it back onto your lease as soon as the storm or the ice flow has gone by. We've got significant issues related to birds that are pitting us between the FDA, which has health concerns about the bacteria in the bird guano, and those in DEM and in the federal agencies that are concerned about the protected resources of highly migratory species. So one group wants us to repel the birds, and one group wants us to continue to provide habitat and forage for these protected resources. We need to get these two agencies to come together and find a workable solution that allows us to grow. And I think that's it. And at this point, I would be happy to stop sharing and maybe try and take some questions. Oh, it looks like there's a few.
That's awesome. That's wonderful. I'm going to start with Margaret's question, which was a direct message to me, just so folks might not see it, but it's applicable to all. How will advances in technology be incorporated into regulations or best management practices? And she's specifically talking about seeing some new moorage gear coming online that reduces the impacts to vegetation. So she's wondering, will there be a process perhaps abbreviated to get these technologies recognized and incorporated into aquaculture? So thoughts either you or Chris might have.
I can provide so as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, the way that NOAA's EFH and ESA consultations work, there's certainly opportunities to incorporate, evaluate how those technologies may reduce impacts, you know, on those NOAA trust resources. And so in that case, you know, and the way that the Army Corps uses the public interest review process, those kinds of benefits can be considered within the existing framework without significant changes to regulation. So I think there's opportunity. The challenge is, you know, as we integrate new technology, we don't have a lot of practical information to really assess how it's going to change impacts. There's a lot of conceptual information. So I think there is going to be a period where we need patience and we need to be gathering information. And that is to some extent where our grant resources have been focused, and sea grants, grant external funding, and NOAA's external funding, as well as internal resources, have definitely been focused towards that direction. But certainly pilots, opportunities to try to deploy those technologies in real world situations is what's going to be necessary for full integration.
And I would just offer that, through best practices, you can regulate with a goal in mind. And if the goal is to prevent scour, then allow these inventive people to figure out how their gear and their site and their mooring technologies can avoid scour. We are very inventive, and given the opportunity, we will find a solution if we are being regulated based on the goal instead of the you must use an auger anchor. You can't drill an auger anchor into a ledge. That's just not going to work.
Great, thank you both. And Steve had a question, and Chris, you answered it, but if you wanted to follow up or elaborate, he asks, are there separate BMPs, best management practices, for floating shellfish aquaculture applicable to the NSSP that were not mentioned today? And the NSSP is the National Shellfish Sanitation Program.
Do you want to take that one, Chris, or should I?
Why don't I start it and then you wrap it up here? So Bob and I are both on the ISSC, the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference Aquaculture Committee, and have both been kind of leading the charge to address new requirements that came out of the 2019 conference and discussions at conferences before that related to the potential impacts from bird and mammal waste, congregations and associated waste on aquaculture gear. And there's two major concerns, one being that birds and mammals congregating on aquaculture gear, as they defecate, it could impact water quality, which you could get to the point where those areas no longer meet the ISSC or NSSP requirements for the harvest of shellfish. There's also the concern about the shellfish taking up any potential human pathogens that are within that waste and then getting folks sick, which I'll let Bob talk about some examples that may be attributed to that. And so the conference added requirements that growers address congregations, take measures to address congregations where they may impact human health. So there's a couple sides of what we're doing. One is figuring out where are those situations where they may impact public health, and what are acceptable means to manage those congregations. Many of these species are protected species, and many of the proven mitigation measures certainly are compatible with our efforts to make our neighbors happy when with the shape and smell and noises that come from the farm. So there's a lot of work here, and there's not one solution. So the ISSC Aquaculture Committee is kind of looking at what other states are doing across the U.S. and in different countries. We've been working with the USDA and some of their expertise for land-based aquaculture. Bob's been kind of leading the charge on some of that coordination and really trying to apply best science as well as collect new science. But as it stands right now, birds are very smart, and one measure may work for a period of time and then lose efficacy, and one measure may be appropriate for some areas and not so much for others. So we're trying to develop a system that works for the environment, and it's a pretty robust effort. So stand by, I guess, is the long way to get to stand by. Bob?
Yeah, well, we haven't established best practices yet. What we are doing is studying a dozen different approaches and seeing how they work. And what we're finding is that, the bird challenges vary tremendously, even just 50 miles away. What they're seeing in Buzzards Bay is different than what we're seeing in Narragansett Bay, in terms of the timing and the species of the birds, and then the gear type. All of these have tremendous amounts of interaction. And then there's issues related to the flow. If you've got 50 birds on 100 cages up in Maine with a 12-foot tide, it's probably not an issue. If you're down in a coastal pond with a 2-foot tide and 3 feet of water, it might be an issue. So, we are wrestling with different species, different, I've got a report that just came out from this past summer's research with a dozen different things that were tried with various measures of success. And we are going to be testing them over a wide range of areas on a bunch of different gear this coming summer to see what works when and where and what's the best approach. And then being always mindful of the fact that, scare kites work in Louisiana, these kites that look like an eagle flying around, but we're not allowed to use them here in Rhode Island because we have the threatened marsh swallow, which might get scared by the scare kite. So, we are trying to really dance this delicate line. And, it may be that the best practice is to sink the product for 7 or 10 days after exposure to bird waste so that it's had a chance to purge itself from potential pathogens of bacteria. It may be a solution, a variety of solutions that are site specific. So we're working, I would say, quite diligently. We see this as an urgent need and one of my top concerns.
If I could just add, I think these competing concerns that we're trying to address here just kind of promote the idea that there needs to be flexibility, but there also needs to be planning. I see another question about storm, advance of storms. All of this, if we're talking about an offshore large-scale project that's going through an environmental impact statement, that's going through this process, all of these types of things must be addressed in their operational plan before the agencies would even consider issuing permits. This is something that if a grower needs, and it's going to be to their benefit to have that kind of flexibility, those kinds of things need to be in plans, needs to be in the thought process of the site. What we saw prior to working with NOAA, I worked for 10 years for the state of Massachusetts as the aquaculture coordinator, aquaculture specialist for the Division of Marine Fisheries, and growers would sometimes need 2 sites, a site for floating gear in the summertime and a site to overwinter that was deeper. That's not always possible, but you can trade off user concerns at some sites in the summertime that might not exist in the wintertime, and really work towards that kind of flexibility. Resource concerns as well, it can be seasonal. So it just goes into how BMPs can encourage that forward thinking. That goes into pre-application development, that goes into those pre-application conversations, and you end up with an application that you're submitting to the agencies that has those considerations laid out, and that's really going to be the key to efficient permitting as far as NOAA is concerned.
And I would just go so far as to say, about submerging a farm in advance of a storm, that too, depending on the site and the gear, can have a problem. It turns out that gear on the bottom tends to be a quiescent zone. And if you're stirring up a lot of sediment because of wave action and you're relatively shallow, the gear fills with sand and actually suffocates the crop. So you're not much better off. We are, experimenting, trying to figure out what types of gear, in a sheltered cove, it's one thing. In an area with serious fetch, it's a very, very different environment and a very different requirement. And designing the gear so that it can withstand a storm. And at some point, Mother Nature is going to tear up anything. So, we're exploring in certain areas, can we get permission to tow floating gear into a secluded cove for a storm? Is that something that the regulatory agencies might permit? Because there's absolutely, category 5, there is nothing that is going to hold up out on the water. I don't care what you do. So we're exploring that option in certain jurisdictions. Seems like North Carolina seems to get hit by 2 or 3 hurricanes a year. Same with the Gulf. So these are challenges that we're trying to work through. And, obviously engineering new gear is going to be a big part of that.
Excellent. Thank you both. Those were great answers. I also wanted to just point out that Bob, you mentioned the Ocean State Aquaculture Association and sort of a part of the evolved BMPs. There could be an element where that association reviews applicants or applications. And so I just wanted to note that the Ocean State Aquaculture Association is our in-state Rhode Island industry association. And I know both Cam Ennis and Matt Bean from Bean Family Farms are on the call. So if you feel free, not to put you on the spot, but if you did want to say anything about some of the work you're doing, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add that I just learned that the Maine Aquaculture Association took the unusual step of evicting a member from the association because they felt there was a bad actor that was reflecting poorly on the industry. So, I mean, they're worried about getting sued for doing so. So, I mean, it's not clear cut, but, you know, we have professionals in this industry who've made major investments, and we need to protect them from the bad actors. We can't really tolerate that any more than the waterfront, other users of the water should be tolerating it.
Great, thanks, Bob.
Yeah, just to speak in to Dr. Rowe's point there. This is the first time the OSAA has ever taken a stance on anything like this. We generally like to support each other as members. You know, farming is difficult enough as it is, but really one application just is such a lightning rod. We've just never seen any blowback this hard in 20 years that some of us have been in the industry, 25, 30 years. There just really hasn't been this much blowback. And, you know, it's not just the people showing up to the public service announcements or whatever you want to call them, the hearings there. It's lawyers, and they're getting very, they're rallying their troops very well, and they've got some good examples and some good points, and it's scary. We don't want to fight these people. We would much rather, like Dr. Rheault was saying, you know, use some peer pressure, use a little bit of influence and a little bit of, just trying to get people to see the big picture. I mean, you know, if you're going to come into an industry that's already booming, and, you know, everything about our industry is so green and so good, and, you know, if people really, really don't like your application, your idea, you know, legally, yes, you can still proceed, but you really shouldn't. You know, there are still enough places, I think, left out there where people can find a spot that isn't going to be a social issue, you know. So we really didn't want to have to take this stance. And to be honest, I've already gotten blowback about us even talking about taking the stance. But, oh, man, this is not a fight that we want to fight. You know, there's too much good that we're doing for this to be all that people are hearing about, you know?
Yeah, Matt, I agree. But what do we hear in Maine? What is it called? The new buzzwords, gentrification of the coast. You know, the working water and things like that. And when I put it in the basic terms that I can, when somebody approaches me for a lease expansion, it's like, are you a good neighbor? Go talk to your neighbors, see how they feel about this. You know, if you put in an application without talking to your neighbors, and now we have the new siting tool, so you actually have to draw a 1,000-foot ring around your proposed site location, and then you print out the names and you go down to the town hall and get their address, which gets sent to CRMC, you know, to put them on notice. But while you have it, you might as well reach out before you submit. That's what I've advised people to do. You know, if you have a municipality and like a corporation that are bordering you that you've worked well with in the past, there's no harm in communication, you know. And if it's not going to work, it's probably not going to work. You have to share the water, and I think we certainly realize that, and we'd like to see other people realize that too. Bob, I couldn't tell you were sick. I thought you were awesome today.
There you go. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Matt and Cam, for chipping in. And it looks like in the chat, Adrian put some Gulf storm prep materials and a reference there for folks. And then Ewan, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us. He asks, is it possible to recognize the need for farms to grow/scale over time to achieve better economies using best practices?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've found is that there certainly are very, very significant economies of scale, and the very, very small farms tend to lose money, a little bit of money each year. And that's great if that's the lifestyle practice you want. But if you want to have a business, you need to achieve a certain level of scale. There's a nice study done by Matt Parker down in UMD, and it looks like it's about 750,000 oysters a year is sort of where farms start to turn around. That's not a 2-acre farm. I certainly, I started small. I started on a 2.3-acre lease, and it was a long time before I achieved the economy of scale where I was making money. So I don't want to say that we shouldn't be permitting small farms. I just, you're absolutely right. We need to be able to grow farms so that they can become professionals and sustainable farms.
If I could just add to that, I mean, I think Rhode Island, just the very fact that it has multiple mechanisms in which to apply for a lease, if I'm correct, is an example of how the system might promote that. But I will say that, something that I saw quite a bit with kelp early on was, with 3 lines and really no opportunity for an economic, for return on investment, it's very difficult to justify going out in January when the storm's coming to take care of your 3 lines as opposed to taking care of your home. And so there is, there needs to be an economic incentive at some point, unless you have the means in which to prioritize your hobby over some of the other priorities in your life. So there's a kind of a double-edged sword there.
Thanks, guys. Kim, did you want to add anything? It looked like your hand was going up. Okay, super. Are there any other questions? We have a few more minutes left. Feel free. You can just unmute and ask them or pop them in the chat. In the meantime, I just wanted to also thank CRMC for joining too. And if there's any sort of words that you would like to say, feel free. Allison, did you have a question? You're on mute. Yeah,
Sorry.
good.
No, not really. So we're working on macroalgae to pick up CO2. And obviously this is something that needs to scale in order to matter. And we're running into how do we manage the regulatory landscape in order to innovate. So this was touched on in this session. Thanks very much for doing that. And, we can talk offline.
Yeah, Allison, it's definitely something that's come up more and more in our permitting discussions, and it's certainly happy to talk offline and direct you to the right people. But
thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Ben, did you want to close us out?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks, Bob and Chris and everyone for participating today. This is an interesting topic, one that I've been looking at for a while now, with Bob's effort both regionally and also looking at other states as they have developed BMPs. And one thing that is interesting about the BMPs is that sometimes they are incorporated into regulation. So something that CMC will be looking at in the future is a state-specific set of BMPs, and we hope to develop those sometime soon.
Excellent. Thank you both, Bob and Chris. This was really wonderful. Thank you all for your time attending. And again, all of these the presentations from today, both Bob and Chris's, as well as the recording, will be online by the end of the week at the BASAMP website that was early on in the chat posted. And I just want to welcome you all to continue to stay engaged in the BASAMP process, sort of one first phase of that lengthy and I think really well thought out process is complete, but there will be, a next phase and some other work, hopefully continuing the working group at some level. And so just look out for announcements through the aquaculture listserv. If you're not on that, please just email Ben and he can get you on that list so you can stay up to date. And again, thank you all so much for your time, and happy spring to you. Stay well.